General Malcolm Rourke had spent 30 years learning to read a battlefield, and in 30 years he had never once mistaken a weapon for furniture. Until today. She was hauling cement in the midday heat, collar dark with sweat, indistinguishable from every other laborer in the yard, and he had walked right past her. It was only when she crouched to pick up a fallen glove that her collar shifted and the badge caught the light. Black and silver, a nightshade sprig. The kind of insignia that didn't get issued, it got earned, in places that didn't appear on any official map. Rourke stopped walking. In 30 years, he had never felt the cold weight of realizing he had almost dismissed the most dangerous person in the room. If you've ever been underestimated, passed over, written off, treated like you were less than you knew yourself to be, stay with this story. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. This is exactly the kind of story we tell. Nadia Kestrel had not always been invisible. 18 months ago, she had commanded Nightshade, a 6-person special operations unit that existed in the space between official orders and unofficial necessity. No press releases, no commendations on public record. The kind of work that kept other people's wars clean by making hers very dirty. She had been good at it. Better than good. Then came Ashen Vale. The Canyon operation had been straightforward on paper. Extract a compromised asset, neutralize the extraction point, disappear before dawn. Nadia had filed a supplemental intelligence report 48 hours before insertion, flagging what she believed was a second ambush corridor that didn't appear in any of the official data. The report went to Colonel Grant Sable. Sable reviewed it, marked it insufficient basis for verification, and filed it at the bottom of a stack that no one would touch. Until it was too late. The mission went wrong in the exact corridor Nadia had flagged. Jonah Rain, her second in command, the only person in Nightshade who had ever stood in front of a superior officer and defended her judgment out loud, took the worst of it. By the time the dust cleared, he was unconscious, his vitals collapsing, and the rest of the unit was already pulling back. Nadia went back in. She dragged him out of the kill zone herself, one arm hooked under his shoulders, moving through ground that was still live. She got him to the medics. She did not leave him. What she didn't know, what no one told her until it was far too late, was that Jonah had lost consciousness before she reached him. He had no memory of being carried out. He had no memory of her at all. In the absence of his testimony, Sable's version filled the vacuum. Nadia had panicked, deviated from formation, and left a man exposed. The injury was her fault. The mission failure was her fault. The lost intelligence asset, a secondary casualty of the chaos, was her fault. The story was clean, documented and signed by a colonel with an unblemished service record and a promotion already in processing. Nadia was suspended from command and transferred to Red Meridian Logistics Station, a resupply depot at the edge of the Karun Desert, where fuel convoys and equipment shipments moved through in predictable rotations, and nothing of strategic consequence ever happened. She was given work gloves and a daily assignment sheet. She hauled cement. She repaired storage walls. She replaced rusted brackets on the ammunition depot without being told why, because no one felt she needed a reason. The soldiers at Red Meridian had heard a version of the story. Most of them found it believable enough. A few of the newer ones laughed when they noticed the Nightshade badge still pinned to her shirt, figured she was holding on to it, the way broken people hold on to the last thing that made them feel worth something. None of them looked closely enough to notice that she never stopped watching. The wind direction, the guard tower rotations, the blind angles between the armored vehicles and the ammunition stores, the exact distance between the eastern wall and the nearest cover. Nadia Kestrel had been a weapon for 11 years. Locking her in a supply yard hadn't changed that. It had only made her quieter. Rourke didn't call her over immediately. He stood where he was and watched her for another 90 seconds, long enough to be certain. She moved wrong for a laborer. Not in a way that would register to someone who hadn't spent decades studying how trained people occupy space. But it was there. The way she set down the cement bag before straightening, giving herself a clean sightline to the yard's northern entrance. The way her eyes tracked the guard rotation without her head moving. The slight adjustment of her footing whenever a vehicle pulled in. Weight redistributed, center of gravity lowered. A body that had never fully stood down from combat, even when it was dressed like it had given up entirely. Across the yard, a transport pilot was running pre-flight checks on a cargo aircraft. Tall, unhurried, the kind of person who moved through checklists the way other people moved through conversations. Rourke had seen her name on the base roster that morning. Bellamy Cass. 1,200 hours, mostly freight runs. Good record, nothing remarkable. She glanced over at Nadia once while running her checks, then looked away. But Rourke noticed the look. Not curiosity, something more careful than that. The look of someone who had already been watching and didn't want to be caught doing it. He filed that away and returned his attention to Nadia. He was still watching when Colonel Grant Sable appeared at his shoulder. "I see you've noticed our problem case." Sable's voice carried the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being believed. He fell into step beside Rourke without being invited, which was itself a small piece of information. Kestrel, former Nightshade team lead, talented operator, genuinely one of the best I've seen come through the program. Which makes what happened at Ashen Vale all the more unfortunate. Rourke said nothing. He had found over the years that silence was a more reliable diagnostic tool than questions. Sable continued. She deviated from formation during the extraction, changed the approach vector without authorization, which collapsed the unit's coverage and left Sergeant Rain exposed in an active kill zone. He nearly died. A measured pause just long enough to land. "I've been trying to protect her from a full court-martial, frankly. Keeping her here in a supervised capacity while the investigation concludes. It's more than the situation warrants. But I believe in giving people a fair process." It was a good performance, regretful without being theatrical, the kind of account that a reasonable man would accept and move on from. Rourke almost did. What stopped him was Nadia herself. During the entirety of Sable's explanation, she had not looked at Sable once. She was looking at Rourke, not pleading, not challenging, not performing anything at all. Just steady, patient attention. The look of someone who had been waiting a long time and had learned not to spend energy on hope. Then she picked up the next cement bag, and Rourke noticed her hands. The knuckles were calloused from the work, yes, but the grip was wrong for someone who'd spent 18 months hauling supplies. She was holding that bag the way a person holds dead weight when they're used to carrying something that fights back. Small detail, the kind that didn't mean anything on its own. Rourke cataloged it alongside everything else and turned to Sable. What was her clearance level before suspension? Sable hesitated half a second, no more. Tier 4, full black access. And she's on wall repair. As I said, supervised capacity. Rourke looked back at the yard. Nadia had moved to the eastern wall and was stacking sandbags with her back to them, but he would have bet his rank that she had clocked the exact position of every person in the yard without appearing to look at a single one. "I'd like to speak with her," Rourke said. Sable's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Of course, General. I'll arrange." "Alone," Rourke said. "Now." The secondary operations room was small and overlit, its walls covered in tactical maps that hadn't been updated in 3 weeks. Rourke closed the door behind them and didn't offer her a seat. She didn't look like she needed one. Up close, Nadia Kestrel was younger than he'd expected and older than she looked. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that didn't come from physical labor. He'd seen it in operators who had spent too long being wrong in ways they couldn't prove. She had that. But underneath it, something else. a stillness that wasn't defeat. Ashen Veil, Rourke said. No preamble. What about it? Sable's account. Is it accurate? She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the nearest map on the wall, a topographical rendering of the Karun region, and pointed to a canyon system in the northeastern quadrant. The official approach vector ran through here. Her finger traced a line along the canyon's primary corridor. Standard extraction route. Clean sight lines, established cover points, 2 fallback positions. Textbook. But I filed a supplemental report 48 hours before insertion, flagging a secondary corridor.
She moved her finger to a parallel ravine, narrower, less obvious.
Thermal imaging from a drone pass showed heat signatures inconsistent with the wildlife pattern in that sector. Not definitive, but worth verifying.
She paused.
Sable marked it insufficient and didn't pass it up the chain.
He says you deviated from formation.
I went back for rain. Her voice didn't shift. The unit had begun extraction. Jonah was down in the secondary corridor, the one I flagged. The one that wasn't supposed to have hostiles in it. She turned from the map and looked at Rourke directly. I pulled him out. He was unconscious when I reached him. He has no memory of it. That's the gap Sable built his report on. Rourke studied her. You understand how that sounds. I understand exactly how it sounds. I've had 18 months to think about it. He believed her. He wasn't entirely sure why, instinct maybe, or the quality of her stillness, or the fact that Sable had hesitated for half a second when asked about her clearance level. Whatever the reason, he believed her. That didn't mean he could act on it. He was still formulating a response when the door opened and a signals officer stepped in, pale-faced, holding a printed dispatch. General, priority message from Forward Intelligence, marked urgent. Rourke took the paper, read it once, read it again. An intelligence analyst operating under the call sign Lark, male, mid-40s, civilian background, had been captured by Black Dune, an armed faction operating in the Karun border region, and was being held at an abandoned research station called Glass Quarry. Estimated time before transfer across the border, 30 hours. Lark was carrying full data on the military's counterintelligence network, every embedded asset, every active channel. If that data crossed the border, the damage would take years to quantify. There were no special operations units within viable deployment range. Rourke set the paper down and looked at Nadia. She had already read it, upside down, from across the table. He could tell by the way her weight had shifted, that subtle drop in the center of gravity he'd noticed in the yard. A body moving from standby to ready, without conscious instruction. You know Glass Quarry, he said. It wasn't a question. Passed through the sector twice during active deployment. I know the terrain. Sable will argue against this. Sable argues against anything he didn't initiate. She said it without heat as a statement of operational fact. Rourke was quiet for a long moment. 30 hours. No available units. An analyst whose capture would compromise every active intelligence asset the military had spent the better part of a decade building. And standing across from him, a Tier 4 operator in a dusty work shirt who had just spent 18 months being treated like furniture. If I authorize this, he said, and it goes wrong, then I lose everything. Her voice was even. I've already lost everything once. I know what it costs. Rourke picked up the dispatch and looked at it one more time. Then he set it down with the quiet finality of a man making a decision he intends to stand behind. You leave at 0300, he said. Tell me what you need. What Nadia needed was a Nightshade team. What she got was 5 people who had never been to the front of anything. Rourke pulled them from Red Meridian's support divisions and had them assembled in the briefing room within the hour. Nadia stood at the front and looked at them the way a surgeon looks at the instruments available when the right ones aren't on the tray. Assessing, recalibrating, not complaining. Rowan Hale, combat medic, 29 years old. Steady hands, good instincts, and a documented aversion to live fire situations that had developed after he lost his first patient to a wound he'd been trained to treat. He'd requested a rear posting 6 months ago and been granted it without question. He was sitting with his shoulders slightly forward, the posture of someone bracing for something unpleasant. Celine Ward, signals and communications specialist. Fast, precise, capable of pulling a clean frequency out of interference that would make most operators give up. She had also never been deployed beyond the wire. Her file noted she had twice declined field reassignment. She was watching Nadia with the careful attention of someone trying to decide whether to trust what they were seeing. Evo Marin, long-range marksman. Quiet in the way that wasn't peace, the way that was something unresolved living behind the eyes. 18 months ago, he had missed a shot that had mattered, and he had been recalibrating his relationship with his own hands ever since. He hadn't spoken since entering the room. Theo Vance, demolitions and mechanical entry. Competent, practical, the kind of person who approached every problem as an engineering question. His file was clean. His nerves, Nadia suspected, would be the least complicated thing in the room. Cass Bellamy, transport pilot. 1,200 hours in cargo aircraft, fewer than 40 in tactical situations. She flew well, everyone agreed on that, but her instincts had been built around predictable conditions, scheduled routes and runways that didn't move. She was the last one to sit down and the only one who didn't look at Nadia when she entered. She was looking at the ceiling, running some private calculation that had nothing to do with the briefing and everything to do with whether she belonged in it. None of them had worked together before. None of them had expected to be here. And all of them, in their various ways, were looking at Nadia with the uncertainty of people who had heard a story about her and weren't sure how much of it to believe. She didn't address the story. She didn't explain herself or offer reassurances. She simply began. For the next 4 hours, she ran them through a series of drills that were short, precise, and deliberately brutal in their feedback.
Movement through unstable ground, the sand behind the eastern depot, deep enough to pull at the ankles. Communications blackout protocols. Celine running signal recovery while Nadia introduced interference from 3 directions simultaneously.
Mechanical entry under time pressure. Theo had 90 seconds to work a lock while Evo counted down in his ear. Casualty transport across broken terrain. Rowan carrying dead weight while Nadia moved the course markers, without warning. Midway through the 3rd drill, Nadia pulled Cass aside while the others reset. "You've never done a tactical extraction," Nadia said. It wasn't a question. "No." Cass kept her voice even. "I've done plenty of extractions, just not the kind where people are shooting at me." "The shooting isn't your problem. Your problem is you're going to want to land." Nadia looked at her steadily. "There won't be a landing. You'll be hovering in conditions that will tell you hovering is impossible. And every instinct you have will say put it down, find solid ground, do what you were trained to do. You can't listen to that." Cass was quiet for a moment. "So, what do I listen to?" "The line," Nadia said. "When the last person is on the line, you pull up. That's the whole job." Cass held her gaze, then nodded once. Not the nod of someone who had been reassured, but the nod of someone who had just received a precise set of instructions and intended to follow them. Midway through the final drill, Rowan straightened up and said without accusation, "What actually happened at Ashen Vale?" The yard went quiet. Nadia didn't answer immediately. She picked up the weight Rowan had been carrying, repositioned it, and set it back down. "Rain went down in a corridor that wasn't supposed to be hot," she said. "I went back and got him out. He was unconscious before I reached him. He doesn't remember it." She looked at Rowan. "That's the whole story." Rowan nodded slowly, said nothing else. But when the next drill began, he moved differently. They all did. At 2100 hours, Nadia spread the thermal imaging scans across the briefing table, and the room went quiet in the wrong way. Glass Quarry had been a geological research station before the conflict made the border region uninhabitable for anyone without a weapon. The surface structure was a cluster of low concrete buildings arranged around a central courtyard, entry points, mapped sightlines, calculated, cover positions, identified. Sable's plan was a direct assault on the main building, breach the eastern entrance, neutralize resistance, extract Lark from the primary holding area, withdraw to the designated pickup coordinates. Clean, aggressive. Built on the assumption that the surface map was complete. It wasn't. Nadia had been staring at the thermal scans for 20 minutes before she saw it. A faint but consistent heat differential along the southwestern quadrant of the courtyard floor. Too regular to be geological, too contained to be residual surface warmth. She pulled the oldest available survey data on Glass Quarry, cross-referenced it with the thermal imaging, and found what the military's intelligence package had missed entirely. A secondary sublevel, pre-existing, built into the original research station's foundation, and never included in any of the tactical maps currently in circulation. She put her finger on the courtyard floor in the scan. Lark isn't in the main building. The room looked at where she was pointing. There's a sublevel here, she continued. Single access point, most likely a maintenance hatch in the courtyard. 3 ventilation shafts on the northern side, all of them narrow enough to be trapped without much effort. She looked up. If we follow Sable's plan and breach the eastern entrance, we walk into an empty building. Black Dune lets us clear the surface, then eliminates Lark below ground before we figure out where to look. Celine leaned over the scan. How confident are you? Confident enough that I'm not willing to run the alternative. Theo studied the ventilation shaft positions. If they've booby-trapped the shafts, the access hatch is the only clean entry point. One way in. One way in, Nadia confirmed. Which means we don't breach loud. We go through the courtyard quietly, find the hatch, and get below before they know we're inside the building. The silence that followed wasn't doubt. It was the stillness of people recalibrating around a new reality. Nadia rolled up the surface map, Sable's map, and set it aside. I'm going to Rourke with this. Sable's plan gets shelved. She looked around the table. I need all of you to understand what that means. If I'm wrong about the sublevel, this mission fails, and I take full responsibility. If I'm right, and we run Sable's plan anyway, Lark dies underground while we clear empty rooms. She paused. I've been in that situation before. A flagged report, a commander who didn't want to hear it, and people who paid for that decision with their lives. I'm not running that play again. No one spoke for a moment. Then Ivo, who had said almost nothing since the briefing began, looked up from the thermal scan. Show us the access point, he said quietly. Let's figure out how to get through it. It was the first time he had volunteered anything. Nadia noted it and moved on because there wasn't time for anything else. But she noted it. Sable found out within the hour. Rourke had approved the revised plan in the operations room with the door closed. But he had needed a signals officer to log the change in the formal mission record. Standard procedure, non-negotiable. The kind of administrative requirement that existed precisely because closed-door decisions still needed a paper trail. The signals officer was 23 years old and had been at Red Meridian for 4 months and had no reason to know that logging a plan revision at 2200 hours would reach Sable's desk before the ink was dry. It wasn't a leak. It was just how a small base worked. By 22:30, Sable was standing in the corridor outside the briefing room, with the surface map in his hand and the hard expression of a man whose authority has been rerouted without his permission. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about Sable, he was most dangerous when he was calm. General Rourke. He addressed Rourke directly, not Nadia, which was itself a calculation. I've been informed that the operational plan for Glass Quarry has been substantially revised. I'd like to understand on whose authority. Mine, Rourke said. Based on analysis provided by a suspended operator who has been on labor detail for 18 months. Sable set the map down on the nearest surface with deliberate care. I want to be precise about what we're doing here. We have a 30-hour window to recover a critical intelligence asset. We have an established plan built on verified field data, and we are replacing that plan with a sub-level theory derived from thermal scans by someone who is currently under investigation for a command failure that nearly killed one of her own people. He let that sit for a moment, then continued. I'm formally requesting that operational authority for Glass Quarry be returned to my office. I'll run the original plan with a proper assault team. Whatever Kestrel thinks she saw in those scans, she's right. The voice came from across the room. Everyone turned. Celine was standing at the far end of the table, her laptop open, the thermal imaging pulled up on the screen. I've been running a secondary analysis for the last 40 minutes, cross-referencing the thermal differential with the original construction permits for the station. She turned the screen so Sable could see it. The sublevel is real. It's approximately 400 square feet, built into the foundation during the original construction, and excluded from the military survey because no one thought to request the civilian records. She paused. If we breach the eastern entrance, the way your plan specifies, we clear a building that's been empty for at least 12 hours. The heat signatures in the main structure are residual. The room was very quiet. Sable looked at the screen. Then he looked at Nadia. Then he looked at Rourke. Even so, he said, and there was something different in his voice now, flatter, more careful. A 5-person support team, led by a suspended operator entering a subterranean position through a single access point, with a sandstorm closing in and no viable extraction window that is. Not a recoverable situation if it goes wrong. No, Rourke agreed. It isn't. Then you understand my concern. I understand it. Rourke looked at him steadily. Request denied. Sable held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, then picked up the map, turned, and walked out. The room exhaled, but the damage wasn't done. Within 20 minutes, the tension had filtered down to the team. Rowan found Nadia in the equipment room and told her quietly that Cass had just received a weather update. The sandstorm was accelerating, projected to reach full intensity over the Glass Quarry sector by 0400, well within their operational window. The extraction coordinates would be effectively unusable. Nadia was checking her kit when he told her. She didn't stop. Tell Cass she won't be landing, Nadia said. She'll be hovering. There's a difference. Rowan stared at her. In a sandstorm. In a sandstorm. She pulled the strap on her pack and tested the tension. Tell Evo I need him in the yard in 10 minutes. And tell Celine to reconfigure her comms for short-burst transmission. We'll lose sustained signal underground, so she works in intervals. She glanced at Rowan. You've carried worse than Lark in worse conditions. I've never carried anyone in a sandstorm. First time for everything. She said it without irony, and somehow that was steadier than reassurance would have been. Rowan stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to find Cass. In the yard, under the first distant moan of the approaching storm, Nadia finished her equipment check alone. She thought about Jonah, not the version in the official report, but the real one, unconscious in the dirt of Ashenvale, with the canyon still hot around him. She had not left him. She would not leave anyone tonight. She picked up her pack and walked toward the vehicles. They reached Glass Quarry at 0240, 20 minutes ahead of the storm's leading edge. The station emerged from the darkness in pieces. First the outer perimeter fence, then the low silhouette of the concrete buildings against a sky that had begun to churn with suspended sand. Cass set the transport down half a kilometer out and killed the running lights. From that point, they moved on foot. Nadia took point. The ground was hardpan with loose gravel overlay, the kind of surface that punished noise and rewarded patience. She moved them in a staggered line, Theo behind her left shoulder, Evo behind her right, Celine and Rowan trailing with the medical kit and the extraction harness. No one spoke. The wind was already picking up, which helped with sound cover and hurt with everything else. The eastern entrance. Sable's breach point was exactly as the thermal scans had suggested. Unguarded, unlit, and empty. They passed it without slowing. The courtyard was open ground, 40 meters of exposure between the outer wall and the central structure. Nadia clocked 2 guards on the northern roof, 1 on the western, all 3 running a rotation that left a 40-second window on the courtyard's southwestern quadrant. She watched 2 full cycles to confirm the timing, then moved. They crossed in 2 groups, no contact. The maintenance hatch was where the thermal imaging had placed it, recessed into the courtyard floor, concealed beneath a rusted equipment panel that hadn't been moved in years, until recently. Fresh scratches around the locking mechanism. Someone had been through it within the last 24 hours. Theo had it open in under 4 minutes. The shaft below was dark and carried the cold of underground spaces that don't circulate air properly. They went down. The sublevel was exactly 400 square feet, low-ceilinged and divided into 3 rooms by prefabricated partition walls. The first room was empty. The second had been used recently. Food wrappers, a portable light source, zip ties cut from someone's wrists. The third room, at the end of a narrow corridor, had a steel door with a manual bolt. Nadia slid the bolt. Lark was inside. He was seated against the far wall, wrists bound, a chemical light stick dying on the floor beside him. Mid-40s, civilian build, the look of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 2 days and had just run out. He looked up when the door opened and said nothing for a moment, just processed the way people do when relief is too large to speak. "Can you walk?" Nadia asked. "Yes." His voice was rough. "Slowly." Rowan was already moving, cutting the restraints, running a fast assessment. Nadia turned to Celine. "Get the data." Lark reached into his jacket and produced a small encrypted drive. Celine took it, connected it to a retrieval unit, and began the transfer. That was when the alarm triggered. Not a siren, something subtler. A low-frequency pulse that Celine recognized immediately. "It's a security protocol," she said, her voice tight but controlled. "Built into the drive. Activates automatically when the data is accessed outside a verified safe zone. It's not a trap. It's a military failsafe." She looked up. "But it just broadcast our position on every frequency Black Dune monitors." Above them, through the concrete ceiling, they heard movement. Boots. More than 2 people moving with purpose toward the courtyard. Then Cass's voice crackled through the earpiece, barely cutting through the static. "Storm's here early, full intensity. I can't hold a stable hover above the extraction point. Wind shear's too severe. I'm circling at 200 feet, but I've got maybe 1 clean window, and I don't know when it's coming." Celine looked at the progress indicator on her retrieval unit. "Transfer is 60%. I need 4 more minutes." The bolt on the hatch above them, the only way in or out, began to move. Nadia looked at the room. 1 exit. Hostile contact incoming from above. A compromised extraction window. A target who couldn't move fast. And 4 minutes they did not have. She had been here before. Not this room, not this mission, but this exact geometry of bad options and shrinking time. At Ashenvale, she had frozen for 3 seconds before she moved. 3 seconds that had cost her everything that came after. She did not freeze this time. "Theo," she said, "the partition wall between room 1 and the shaft access. How fast can you bring it down on a controlled delay?" Theo was already looking at it. 2 minutes to set, 30-second delay. "Do it." Celine finished the transfer. "Rowan, get Lark to the far wall and keep him flat." She looked at Evo. You and I are going to make a lot of noise in room 2. The hatch came open, and the first 2 Black Dune fighters dropped into the sublevel before Theo had finished setting the charge. Nadia and Evo were already in room 2, positioned on opposite sides of the partition gap. The fighters swept left, toward the noise, toward the light Nadia had deliberately left running. And Evo took the first one cleanly, a single shot that broke the silence and answered the question he had been carrying for 18 months. His hands did not shake. He looked faintly surprised by that, and then he looked at nothing but the corridor and kept moving. Nadia took the second fighter at close range, fast and efficient, the way she did everything. 2 more were coming down the shaft. She could hear the third one on the ladder. "Theo," she said into the comm. 15 seconds. She pulled back to the doorway of room 3, putting the partition wall between herself and the shaft access. Evo flattened against the corridor wall. The third fighter hit the floor, and the fourth was halfway down the ladder when Theo's charge detonated a percussive crack tightly directed that brought the partition wall down across the entrance to room 1 and buried the base of the shaft under a meter of prefabricated concrete and debris. The hatch was sealed. So was the only way out. Celine's voice cut through the ringing, "Transfer complete." "Exit," Nadia said. "There is no exit." Celine looked at the collapsed wall. That was the exit. There's a drainage channel running under the western foundation. Original construction survey, it connects to a dry wash approximately 80 meters northwest of the perimeter fence. Nadia was already moving to the far corner of room 3, where the floor showed a hairline seam that didn't match the surrounding concrete. "Theo." Theo looked at the seam, looked at his remaining charge, and did the calculation. "It'll hold. Barely. Barely is enough." Through the debris above them they could hear more movement, Black Dune repositioning on the surface, working toward the perimeter, cutting off the ground roots. And beneath everything, the constant low roar of the storm, which had stopped being background noise and become the dominant fact of the world outside. Theo set the second charge. They pulled back. The floor cracked open along the seam and dropped into a drainage channel, barely wide enough for a person moving sideways with their pack turned flat. Rowan went first, with Lark moving in the shuffling half-crouch the space demanded. The channel smelled of old concrete and standing water and the staleness of enclosed spaces that hadn't moved air in years. Lark was slower than ideal, but he was moving Rowan's hand steady on his back, voice low and continuous, pulling him forward, one step at a time, the way Rowan had learned to move patients who couldn't afford to stop. Celine followed close behind, the drive secured inside her jacket, one hand trailing the wall for orientation. Theo came next, then Evo, who paused at the channel entrance and looked back once at the room they were leaving, then dropped in without a word. Nadia went last. She was 3 meters into the channel when the ventilation system above the sublevel activated. She could feel the pressure change, the first trace of something chemical carried on the forced air. Black Dune, clearing the space the fast way. She moved faster. The channel was 80 meters. It felt longer. Every 10 meters, the ceiling dropped another few centimeters, as though the earth above them was slowly remembering its own weight. The storm above ground transmitted itself through the soil as a constant vibration, sand hissing through every gap in the concrete around them. Celine lost signal completely at the midpoint and regained it in fragments, her transmissions clipped and irregular just enough to tell Cass they were still moving. Rowan talked Lark through every meter in a low, continuous murmur that served no tactical purpose, and every human one. At the 60-meter mark, Lark's legs gave out. Rowan caught him before he hit the ground. No hesitation, no assessment, just the automatic catch of someone whose body had decided before his mind could. He pulled Lark's arm across his shoulders and kept moving, half carrying him through the last 20 meters with his back bent against the low ceiling and his breathing controlled and deliberate. They came up through a deteriorated grate into the full force of the sandstorm. The world was brown and shrieking and reduced to 5 feet of visibility in every direction. Nadia pulled herself out of the channel and heard Cass in her earpiece, barely through the static and the wind. I've got one window, 30 seconds, maybe less. Northwest of the fence line, there's a depression in the ground the storm's creating a low-pressure pocket. I can hold a static hover at 20 feet for 30 seconds if you can get a line on the harness. After that, I have to pull up or I lose the aircraft. Nadia looked at the group. Lark could not climb an ascent line. Rowan understood this before she said it and was already reconfiguring the extraction harness into a tandem rig. Rowan takes Lark up first, Nadia said. Celine, Theo, Ivo, standard interval. Move. They moved. Cass found the pocket and held it with the precise, ferocious focus of a pilot who had just discovered what she was actually capable of. The line dropped through the storm. Rowan clipped in with Lark and they went up. Celine, Theo. Ivo reached the line and stopped, looked back at Nadia. Come on, I'm right behind you. He clipped in and went up. Nadia was reaching for the line when the grate behind her shifted. One of the Black Dune fighters had found the channel. She held the exterior hatch shut with both hands and her full body weight for 17 seconds, that were the longest 17 seconds she had experienced since a canyon in Ashenvale. Then the line dropped back down, Cass's voice in her ear. Last pass, now or never. She grabbed the line. The storm swallowed glass quarry behind her as Cass pulled the aircraft up and away, and Nadia hung in the roaring dark with the extraction harness biting into her shoulders and the drive safe in Celine's jacket. And everyone, every single one of them, accounted for. They landed at Red Meridian at 0531. Rourke was on the tarmac when the transport touched down, which told Nadia everything she needed to know about whether he had slept. He watched them come off the aircraft one by one, Rowan and Lark first, then Celine, Theo, Ivo. And when Nadia stepped down, he looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at Lark, who was upright and moving under his own power, and at Celine, who was holding the drive with both hands, like she intended to keep holding it until someone pried it away from her. "Get Lark to medical," Rourke said to Rowan. "The drive goes to the intelligence room. No one touches it until I'm present." He said nothing else until the others had cleared the tarmac. Then he looked at Nadia. "Sable filed a formal complaint at 0300, he said. "Unauthorized deviation from operational parameters. Conduct unbecoming. He's requesting your immediate detainment pending investigation." Nadia said nothing. "I told him to put it in writing," Rourke continued. "He's doing that now." He paused. "It won't matter. But I wanted you to know he moved fast." "He always moves fast when he's covering ground," Nadia said. Before they reached the intelligence room, Rourke stopped at the medical bay door. Through the narrow window, Nadia could see Rowan settling Lark onto a cot, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had discovered something about himself in a drainage channel at 60 meters and intended to keep it. Beside the cot, a secondary chartboard held the names of patients currently in observation. Third entry from the top, written in standard medical shorthand, Rain J. Status, conscious. Stable. Cleared for formal interview pending psych review. Nadia looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she followed Rourke down the corridor. She had known in the abstract that Jonah was alive. The medical reports had said as much. For months, in the flat language of clinical updates that described vital signs without describing a person. But conscious was different from alive. Cleared for formal interview was different from both. She filed it away and kept moving because there was still work to do, and she had learned a long time ago not to spend herself on things she couldn't yet hold. The intelligence room was operational within the hour. Lark, stabilized and coherent after Rowan's treatment, sat across from Rourke and 2 senior analysts and walked them through everything on the drive. Not just the counterintelligence network data that Black Dune had been after, but the operational records he had been compiling for 11 months as part of a separate internal review. Records that Lark had been quietly assembling because certain patterns in the Karun sector had stopped making sense to him in ways he couldn't attribute to incompetence alone. The Ashen Veil file was in there, complete, unredacted. Rourke read it in 40 minutes. When he finished, he set it down and sat with it for a long moment. Then he called for Sable. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Nadia was not present for it, but she heard the outcome from Rourke directly, in the same secondary operations room where she had stood at the beginning of all this and pointed to a canyon on a map that no one had wanted to look at. Sable had suppressed her supplemental report before Ashenvale because the secondary corridor she had flagged ran directly through a sector he had already cleared in an earlier operation, one that had been cited in his promotion review. Acknowledging the second ambush route meant acknowledging that his clearance had been incomplete. When the mission went wrong, the path of least resistance was a suspended operator with no witness and a silent casualty. He had built his account on the assumption that Jonah Rain would never recover enough to contradict it. That assumption had just expired. Rain regained full consciousness 6 days ago, Rourke said. He slid a medical report across the table, the full version, not the shorthand on the board outside the bay. He's been asking to make a formal statement since he woke up. We didn't know what he was referring to until tonight. Nadia looked at the report but didn't pick it up. She had spent 18 months not allowing herself to need Jonah's testimony. She found now that it existed that she didn't quite know what to do with the relief. He said you came back, Rourke said quietly. He said you were the last thing he heard before he went under. Your voice telling him to hold on. She said nothing for a moment. Outside, the storm had begun to break, the first gray light pressing through the dust. Sable? She asked. Relieved of command pending a full investigation, he won't be returning to field authority. Rourke paused. Your suspension is lifted, effective immediately. Nightshade is being stood back up. The Ashenvale file goes to independent review. Nadia nodded once. It was not the nod of someone receiving unexpected news. It was the nod of someone who had known the truth for 18 months and was watching it finally become the official version. There's one more thing I need, she said. Rourke waited. My team. Hale, Ward, Marin, Vance, Bellamy. I want them in the Glass Quarry mission record as a designated tactical unit. Not support personnel. Not auxiliary. A unit. Rourke studied her. Then he picked up a pen. Done, he said. The storm finished clearing by 8 o'clock, leaving the yard washed clean of the top layer of red dust, and everything looking slightly more itself than it had the day before. Nadia found the unfinished blast wall on the eastern side of the yard, where she had left it 3 courses of sandbags short of completion. The cement work still rough at the seams. She picked up a bag from the supply stack and set it into place. Then another. She wasn't sure why exactly. Something about finishing what she had started. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn. Rowan stopped a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets. He stood there for a moment, watching her work. Then Celine appeared beside him, and Theo behind her, and Evo and Cass after that. None of them having arranged it, all of them having arrived at the same place at the same time, the way people do when something unspoken pulls them in the same direction. No one said anything for a while. Nadia set another bag into place. You should probably stop doing manual labor, Cass said eventually. You're reinstated. Someone else can finish the wall. I know, Nadia said. She set the last bag and stepped back to look at it. I wanted to finish it. Evo, who had said little since they landed, looked at the wall for a moment. Then he picked up the last loose sandbag sitting beside the stack, the one nobody had claimed, and set it into place beside hers. No explanation, no ceremony. Just a man deciding that finishing things was worth doing. Nadia glanced at him. He looked back, steady his hands at his sides. The question he had carried for 18 months had been answered in a corridor under Glass Quarry. He didn't need to say that out loud. She reached into the front pocket of her shirt and took out the Nightshade badge. She had been carrying it loose since they landed, not yet certain of the gesture. Now she pinned it back where it belonged, not the frayed position it had occupied for 18 months of labor detail, but straight, deliberate, the way it had sat when she'd first earned it. Behind her, she heard Rourke approach across the yard. He stopped at a respectful distance, the way a man stops when he understands he is entering something that isn't entirely his to enter. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said. Nadia turned. The morning light was full now, the desert opening up gold and flat in every direction. "You thought I was a laborer," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of what had happened. "I almost walked past you," Rourke said. "I won't pretend otherwise." "Most people did. That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him steadily. "But you stopped. That's the part that mattered." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "I assumed the dust was the whole story." Nadia glanced at the badge on her chest. Clean now, the silver catching the light. Then back at the general standing in front of her, and at the 5 people behind her who had gone underground in a sandstorm on 12 hours of preparation and come back with everyone breathing. "Sometimes," she said, "that's exactly where they put the dangerous ones." Rourke held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded the nod of a man who has updated his understanding of something important and intends to carry that update forward. He walked back toward the operations building. The 6 of them stood in the yard as the desert finished waking up around them. Nobody moved to leave. There was no particular reason to stay either, just the gravity of people who had been through something together and weren't quite ready to let it become the past. Eventually, Cass said, "So, Nightshade." Nadia looked at her, at all of them. "Nightshade," she said. Nadia spent 18 months being walked past, talked over, and written off, and she never stopped being exactly who she was. That's the thing about real capability. It doesn't disappear just because someone stops looking for it. It waits. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. Every week we bring you stories about people who were underestimated, overlooked, and proved wrong. Every assumption made about them. Because the most dangerous person in the room isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes they're the one hauling cement.